Hello, everybody, and welcome to Informasia for the 18th of May, 2026. I'm Patricia Yarrow. I'm to blame for everything, especially when it doesn't work, but so far so good. I started Informasia some years ago when COVID first hit. We meet on the third Monday of every month, and here an academic gives some kind of talk about their research into Japan or Asia in general. We have got quite a few interesting speakers coming up soon. Tonight, we are very pleased and very honored to have Susanna Fessler join us to give us a talk. By the way, she has been in academia for quite a while. She sent me her resume with her CV, and it's like just absolutely insane. She's been busy for many years, so we are very pleased to have her join us for a while here. And I think perhaps with that, that's enough. If it's all right with you, Susanna, would you like to
Absolutely
turn it over to you?
Yep, let's see if I can do my screen share the way we're supposed to.
Okay.
I hope everybody can see that.
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, before I even start, I want to give a shout out to Alex Byrne, because this project never would have happened if I hadn't been corresponding with him about Robert Prine, and then eventually we started talking about Portman, and at one point Alex said, yeah, he's a mysterious kind of figure, like nobody even knows what his middle initials mean. And for me, that was like throwing down the gauntlet. It's like, oh, I have to figure this out. I have to figure out who this guy is. And so I went down that rabbit hole, and that was about 3 years ago. So I did that. I went down that rabbit hole and tried to find out more about this Meiji figure that is sometimes mentioned, but usually when he's mentioned, the information is erroneous. That also fascinated me as a scholar. Move my cursor over here. His middle initials, there it is, Alex. His middle initials stood for Ludwig Christian, but he usually just signed his name as A.L.C. I got a lot of feedback there. I hope that's okay. So he lived 1826 to 1872. This is the only photograph that I've been able to find of him. And again, Alex and I have been back and forth about other possible photographs of Portman, but as far as I know, this is the only one out there. And I'll show you that full photograph in another couple slides. You'll get to see that. So I want to preface what I'm going to say by saying that diplomatic history, and I know a lot of you are really interested in the Meiji period, is usually focused on sort of the formal authority, who was appointed as what minister, what treaties were signed, what battles were fought, things like that. And underlying all of that is the support staff. That's what we would call them today. So what do I mean by that? That the secretaries, the interpreters, the go-betweens, the people who were really making things work. And we rarely hear about them. And Portman is a prime example of this. I got interested in Portman because I was transcribing the letters of Robert Prine, who was the second minister after Townsend Harris. And Prine was from Albany, New York, and his papers are here in Albany, New York. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time transcribing the letters that he had written home to his wife during the 3 years that he was living in Japan. And he kept mentioning Portman. Portman does, oh, Portman's here. Portman does, all this about Portman. But no biographical information. And actually, he never even, in any of the letters that I transcribed, explained to his wife who Portman was. So Portman is in the background, and that's the basic thesis of my talk today, is that that's why I called him the accidental diplomat, is that we know a lot about the ministers, the American ministers, but we don't know about Portman and the other people who were working for the ministers during that time. So Portman was born in Amsterdam. He was a Dutchman, born in 1826, and he was the first son of an artist named C.J.L. Portman. C.J.L. Portman, whose portrait you see here on the right, was an artist of some renown. If you Google him, you'll see various paintings, portraits, whatever. And his son, Anton, initially aspired to also be an and so Williams, at first, Perry asks Williams, will you be my interpreter? And Williams says, I'm not the right guy. I don't really speak Japanese. I know a little bit, and it's like stuff I learned from sailors, and it's not proper. But Perry was insistent and basically didn't give him much choice. So Williams kept a record of that experience. And on the very first page, he says, essentially, I was not the right guy, but I went anyway. Actually, Williams was useful in the Ryukyus because Chinese worked there. But once the boat got up to Edo, he was not particularly useful. Okay, so as just about everybody knows, the Americans sail into Edo Bay in 1853, and there's this kind of communication crisis on deck. There's different accounts on the Japanese side and the American side of this event, with small differences in the details. But generally speaking, they all agree that this happened, that there was a lot of shouting back and forth between the Japanese boats and the launches and the American ships. And there's not a lot of communication going on because the Chinese isn't helping. Williams is there, and that's not helping. And then, according to many of the records, one of the Japanese in the launches says in English, and the record says this was like the only English that he knew, something like, I speak Dutch. And that was a breakthrough. And so I imagine what happened is everybody on deck looks around and says, oh dear, now what are we going to do? And then someone says, hey, Portman, let's get Portman. Portman speaks Dutch. He's a Dutchman. And so he gets dragged up from under deck, from down below, and he is essentially instantly made this key figure in the communication between the Americans and the Japanese. Again, he was not hired to do that, but he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And that's a little bit of the story of his life, is being in the right place at the right time without that particular intention. So we never hear about him, right? If you read the record about who was doing what during that whole period, he is so rarely mentioned. It's really quite fascinating to me. So he goes from being a clerk to the official interpreter. So he's translating from English to Dutch, and then the Japanese are translating from Dutch to Japanese. That's also a fact that I think most of you are probably familiar with. It was a three-way process, or a three-step process. Samuel Wells Williams says that he gladly stepped aside, that he knew that he was not the right person to be involved in any of this. So he was present at many of those early meetings, but he wasn't active. He wasn't actually translating much. And so Portman becomes that primary interlocutor for the Americans. He is that key person for Perry throughout that whole process. Then, this was a long process, as everybody knows. When 1853, 1854, Commodore Perry, here is a picture many of you may be familiar with, arrives at a banquet in Yokohama. It's not clear to me that any of the figures in that drawing are Portman, but as I was mentioning earlier, Portman liked to sketch. And actually he did some sketches of his visit in Japan, of his time in Japan, and this is one of them. So he drew this, but he's also in the picture. So that circle in the upper, that oval in the upper left, that's Portman. So he sketches this and he places himself right in the middle of the table. Who knows? Maybe that was inaccurate. Maybe he was trying to make himself more important, but there he is. He signed the picture in the bottom right. That was Portman. And on the left at the bottom, he names all the people. And on the right, all the Japanese who were sitting in this picture. So all the other names are probably familiar to Meiji scholars, but Portman maybe not so much, right? So there he is translating. So Portman does all that. The Perry expedition ends, and he returns to the United States in 1855. The Perry expedition didn't return en masse back to the US, kind of split up, and people went back in bits and pieces, so to speak, on different boats at different times. But anyway, so Portman, he goes back to the United States in 1855. And then over the next 5 years, he's living in Lower Manhattan on Beaver Street. And he is listed in the New York City directory as a translator. And what you see on your screen is that little excerpt from that directory. A.L.C. Portman, translator. We also know that at some point during those 5 years, one of his siblings, a brother, came over to the United States and was living probably with Portman. He shows up in a later directory at the same address. And then later that brother also becomes sort of the connection for Portman when he's in Japan to the United States. So Portman would send stuff to his brother, and then his brother would forward it on to somebody else. So Portman is back in the United States, and he's there trying to make a living as a translator, which I find really fascinating. I wonder if that had ever occurred to him in the first place when he emigrated to the US. But certainly by the time he came home, he's thinking, hey, I can do this. Right? I did that for Perry. While he's in the US, he also does something interesting. He appeals to Congress. And he says to Congress, hey, you paid me when I was on the Perry expedition, the salary of a commodore's clerk. But actually, I was doing something way above beyond that. I was being the interpreter and the translator for Perry. So can I get back pay for having done that? Can I get the same pay that Williams was getting, which was significant? It was like 7 or 8 times what Portman had been receiving as a clerk. And that appeal to Congress wended back and forth for years, 5 years actually. And eventually, although there was some opposition to it, he did get that back pay pretty late in the game, in 1859, late 1859, I think it was, or early 1860. And he argued his point pretty strongly. So that's actually in the congressional record. You can find that. Meanwhile, what's happening on the Japan front, as most of you know, Townsend Harris is appointed the foreign minister to Japan in 1856. And as you probably know also, Harris was originally from New York and New York State, and was part of that New York State political machine that provided the first 3 ministers to Japan. Harris didn't really know anything particular about Japan, but he takes this position. He's kind of near the end of his career. And so Townsend Harris is setting up shop in Japan at the time. And Townsend Harris chooses this guy, Henry Huskin, as his interpreter. Henry Huskin, just like Portman, is a Dutchman. Huskin emigrated to the United States slightly just after Portman had. I found evidence that actually Huskin and Portman knew each other in New York. that they worked for the same firm. I don't know what firm it was, but worked for the same firm in the United States. And at least one account says that Portman was also considered as the interpreter for Harris, but for reasons I could not discern, Harris does not choose Portman. He chooses Huskin. So Huskin goes off with Harris to Japan. So it's not as if Harris would not have known who Portman was. That it seems highly unlikely to me. So at some point that decision was made. We're going to go with Huskin instead of Portman. Might have been a personality difference or something. I don't really know what's going on there. Okay, so that's what's happening in the late 1850s. And then in 1860, well documented, there's a Japanese embassy to the United States. And what does that mean? It meant that this group came over from Japan, and the Americans really wanted to roll out the red carpet for these folks. They were going to go to Washington, they were going to go to Philadelphia, they went up and down the East Coast. And so in preparation for that, they named a commission, a group of men who would basically be the guides, the hand holders, the hosts for this Japanese embassy. And Portman was chosen as the interpreter for that commission. So he's not in this photograph. He's probably right off to the side. And he was chosen in part because he did know, by this point, he knew a little bit of Japanese. And he was a known quantity to the delegates who were coming because he had been in all these high-level meetings with Perry. And so he gets his foot back in the door, and he reestablishes his indispensability, his importance in these American-Japanese relations, right? So he ends up meeting these old acquaintances of his while the Japanese embassy is traveling. And yet, if you go back and you look at things like this photograph and some of the sketches of that embassy in 1860, you can't see anybody with that really distinctive Portman mustache. So for some reason, he seemed to stay off to the side in a lot of those episodes. Or maybe he didn't, maybe he shaved out that mustache at some point. I don't know. But that photograph, this photograph, that's from that embassy. So here he is pictured with one of the other members of the commission, McDonald. So Portman's on the left, McDonald's on the right. They did a whole series of photographs, both of the Americans and of the Japanese. And these are all in the public domain now. They're not too hard to find. A lot of them are in the Library of Congress or in the Getty collection. So when that was over, that trip of the Japanese was over in the United States, Portman decides that he's going to go back with them. He's going to accompany them. And so he does that. He travels with them. You can see the green arrows on the map here that start on the East Coast, the light green, right? Start on the East Coast and go around off the picture and then back around. And eventually end up back in Japan. So sorry, the green arrows start here, go here, and then they cross over the Atlantic and they end up traveling around Africa and then back to Japan. So that during that journey, Portman is trying to learn Japanese. This is the Niagara that he was traveling on, the USS Niagara. This is it arriving in Edo Bay. After the fact, Portman wrote a couple letters back to the United States, to acquaintances, detailing what his experiences were like on board. And in those letters, he says he's all excited because he's compiling a lexicon of Japanese. So he's very interested in learning Japanese. And that was like one of the big reasons that he agreed to do this. And he was really disappointed because apparently before he got on board, the Japanese said to him, yeah, sure, we'll help you with your Japanese. And then once he got on board, they lost interest in doing that. And so he was kind of left to his own devices in doing it, but he was very excited about doing it and said, I have over 1,000 words in my lexicon and I'm working on it further. And I mention that because when you do find information about Portman later on, there are people who will say, oh, Portman didn't really know any Japanese. But it seems like that's just not true. Maybe if he never perfected it, we've all been there, but certainly he studied really hard. Then what happens? So Portman gets back to Japan in late 1860, in November of 1860. What's happening in Japan in November of 1860? Townsend Harris is still there. He's still the foreign minister. He's been there for a few years. Henry Huskin is still his interpreter. And as scholars of the Bakumatsu know, things are a little tense in Japan in 1860. The American legation is located in the temple Zenpukuji. And this is a photograph of that temple at the time. I have a couple more photographs to share of that. This is in Edo. This is a photograph in the Prime papers here in Albany. This is the gateway to the United States legation. The Prime labels at the bottom. So it's kind of just looking in the other direction. So what happens? So Portman's there from November on, and for a couple months, he spends time rekindling old acquaintances, trying to establish himself in Japan. Later on, he writes to an acquaintance in the United States that he had, this was to Congress, I think later, that he had intended to stay in Japan just for a few months and then return to the United States. I only have one piece of evidence to that end, but it's in Portman's own words, so I trust it. So he's there in November, December. In January of 1861, Henry Huskin is assassinated by disgruntled anti-Western Ronin. Did not see that coming, but there it was. And so, by the way, if you want to know a lot about that, there's a now open source article entirely about it in Monumenta Nipponica from 1994. It was a bloody end. It was not pretty. So what happens? Harris is now without a translator and an interpreter. Within 3 days, Harris hires Portman. Why? Well, Portman was there. Once again, Portman is in the right place at the right time. He's familiar with Japan. He knows the players. He speaks Dutch, and he doesn't have a day job. And so Harris hires him, and then after the fact, writes to Washington and says, I've hired Portman to replace Huskin, and I'll just keep doing that until either he or I feel like it's not working anymore. So Harris continues on for about another year, and then he resigns. He really mourned the loss of Huskin. Huskin was like a son to him. He himself, Townsend Harris, had no children. And so Harris says, that's it, I'm giving up, I'm going to leave. He tells Washington, I'll stick around until you send my replacement, but then I'm out of here. And so Harris is replaced by Prime. This picture of Prime, it's a picture that he loathed, but it's one of the ones in the Albany collection. He didn't like it because he felt like he looked sort of schlumpy. So Prime arrives in Japan in April of 1862, and he overlaps with Harris for only a few days. Prime buys most of the household goods from Harris, the linens, the dishes, all that kind of thing, takes over the American legation, and then Harris shows him around Edo for a couple days, and then he leaves. So where's the continuity here? The continuity is Portman. Portman provides that continuity in the legation. Portman shows Prine the ropes. And then for the next 3 years, Prine relies really, really heavily on Portman. And indeed, there's one point where Portman gets sick and is out of commission for a few weeks. And Prine writes home to his wife how he's just like getting absolutely nothing done because he doesn't have Portman there to help him. And so Portman's doing, he's the secretary and he's the translator for Prine. Prine, after 3 years, leaves, and Portman ends up taking the helm of the American legation. So Prine decides to leave his post in 1865, and he's in a big hurry, and that's a whole nother talk. I could talk about that. And he leaves before a replacement can be sent from Washington. So what's he supposed to do, right? Prine has to tell Washington, who's in charge. And initially there was this big dispute between the U.S. consul, whose name was George Fisher, and Portman about who would be in charge. And Portman, just like he had appealed to Congress for that back pay, he goes to the mat. He'd been reading some of the law books that Harris had in the legation. And he went to Prine and he said, no, legally, I should be the one who is in charge of the legation after you leave. And so he triumphs in that, and Prine writes to Washington that Portman will be the charge d'affaires until a replacement can be sent. And so what that meant was that Portman ends up being in charge of the American legation for an entire year, which I find fascinating because does anybody really talk very much about him? There's a few things you can find out there, and a lot of them are critical, saying that he really didn't, he was just sort of a placeholder, he wasn't doing much. But if you dig deeper, you find out that he was quite active. He wasn't just sitting back and letting things happen. And he wrote what you see on your screen here to Washington about his dedication to the job, right? So he says, with the exception of some 4 years, during which the unfortunate, by that point, Mr. Huskin was acting Secretary of Legation, I have, ever since I sailed from New York in 1852, been connected with our diplomatic business in this country. I'm the man, he's saying. I invariably succeeded in meeting with the approval of my chiefs, enjoyed their confidence, and was honored by their friendship. My responsibility is now temporarily increased because he was a charge d'affaires, but I'm sure I shall succeed in meriting a continuance of that confidence. So Portman says to Washington, I am on the job and I'll take care of things. And he does that for a year. There's a lot happens during that year. We don't have time to talk about it in detail today. Eventually, Washington sends a replacement. It's this man, Robert Van Valkenburg. And he arrives in August of 1866. And when he does, Portman returns to that position of secretary and interpreter. By the way, this later comes back to be quite an issue. What is an issue? Sure, officially he's the interpreter, but when did he suddenly get named the secretary? That seemed to have happened under Prine. And not in an official way, just in the U.S. legation roster. At one point, he starts getting listed as the secretary. So that later is a point of dispute between him and the next minister. Let's mention that quickly. So I didn't say this before, but Prine was another New York politician, came from Albany, knew absolutely nothing about Japan. So those 3 days with Harris were not going to be sufficient in giving him the lay of the land. Van Valkenburg, another member of the New York political machine, shows up in Japan, has no experience with Japan. So you got Harris, Prine, Van Valkenburg. They're all kind of newbies to Japan when they arrive. And so Portman, he's that continuity. He's the one who says, these are the players, here's what's going on, here's how it all works. And Van Valkenburg, like Prime, really depended on Portman. And at one point in 1867, when the Bakumatsu tension was really at its peak, Van Valkenburg had to go off to Osaka. And when he did that, he left the legation in Portman's hands, and that lasted for a few months. So the Bakufu, as we all know, the Bakufu falls, and as the Bakufu control crumbled, the U.S. then was in a bit of a pickle because everybody up until that point, including Van Valkenburg, had supported the Bakufu. And they knew that there was this tension between the imperialists and the Bakufu, but they saw the Bakufu as the official legitimate government. And so everybody, including Portman, was sympathetic to the Bakufu. And actually, Portman was a trusted confidant of the Bakufu officials. And the Bakufu officials told Portman, oh, yeah, those imperialists, they'll never make it. And so Portman tells that to Van Valkenburg. And Van Valkenburg then writes a dispatch to Washington saying the same thing. Reading that dispatch is really fascinating to me because normally what happened is that the minister would write the dispatch and then Portman would copy it neatly and then it would be sent to Washington. So all these dispatches are in Portman's handwriting. But when I'm reading that particular dispatch that's supposedly from Van Valkenburg to Washington, it has really amazing detail in it that I don't think Van Valkenburg would have known, would have been able to produce. And so I suspect that Portman drafted it and showed it to Van Valkenburg, and Van Valkenburg, signed off on it. I have no actual evidence of that. That's just my suspicion. Anyway, so in 1868, Van Valkenburg tells Washington, the movement to unite the whole of Japan under the scepter of the emperor is not a bona fide one, and there's not the remotest prospect of the people being benefited by the results. He could not have been more wrong. We all know that with hindsight, but that's what he wrote. And I think those were probably words that Portman put in his mouth. Again, I have no evidence of that, but just seems perhaps likely. So Van Valkenburg leaves Japan and he's replaced by this guy, Charles DeLong, who is infamous as perhaps the worst minister that the United States ever sent to Japan. So Van Valkenburg leaves in 1869. So the Bakufu is fallen. He's replaced by Charles DeLong, an American with no experience in Japan and a bit of a young rebel. So when he first arrives in Japan, there's sort of a honeymoon period between DeLong and Portman. They get along for a few months, but it really does not last long. The friction between these two men in itself is an academic article, in my opinion. So we don't have time to do that today. So long story short, DeLong accuses Portman of numerous dubious charges. Eventually, he even has Portman imprisoned for a few days. Portman gets a lawyer, gets himself out of jail, and DeLong just keeps attacking him, and while he's in jail, DeLong has all his belongings removed from his residence. It just goes on, right? So DeLong, without even consulting with Washington, tells the Japanese officials Portman is out of here, don't talk to him anymore. And eventually DeLong writes to Washington and says, I'm firing Portman. Portman appeals to Washington. There's a long back and forth, and eventually the State Department just kind of throws its hands up in the air because it really doesn't have much of a choice. DeLong is superior to Portman, and so they side with DeLong, but sort of with hesitance, and there's nothing that they can do about that. So when that happens, DeLong's done something really crazy. He's cut off his nose to spite his face because he fires Portman, but he needs an interpreter and a secretary. And actually, he argues to Washington, look, I need one or the other, but if I can only have one, I need an interpreter because I just can't do this job. And he refused to hire Portman back. There was so much bad blood there that although Portman was there and available, DeLong absolutely refused to hire him back. And so what happens is that DeLong ends up with a long string of incompetent secretaries and interpreters. And maybe that contributed to his notoriety as being, his infamy as being, a really ineffectual minister. So what happens in the end? Portman, throughout this whole ordeal, he remains in Yokohama. He had a residence in Yokohama. There's nothing there today, but well, there's like a big apartment complex, I think it is. So he remains in Yokohama for the next 2 years, and he continues to write to Washington, sort of saying, please, can you do something about this situation? DeLong is making my life miserable. And Washington just doesn't help him because they say, sorry, our hands are tied. And so for the next 2 years, Portman, and these are his words, he says he lives virtually and to all intents and purposes as a prisoner in his own home. He can't leave. DeLong spreads all these nasty rumors amongst the expat community about Portman. So he's a pariah. As I mentioned, DeLong's time in office is marked by incompetence in many different ways. Washington gets so fed up with DeLong that in November of 1871, they call him home temporarily, not permanently at that point. And so he's in Washington until August of 1872, and then he returns to Japan. So that gives Portman a little bit of a reprieve, a few months of no DeLong being around, but DeLong basically had henchmen who did his dirty work. So it wasn't as if that one man being gone made Portman's life really wonderful. He was sort of trying to get his life back together again. And then something that really fascinates me happens as I'm digging through the diplomatic history. If you've ever done this, you know what it's like. 90% of it is really boring stuff that was never even reported out to Congress. If it's really important, they report it out to Congress. But all those dispatches, a lot of them are perfunctory. Every quarter they have to do a sort of budgetary report and whatnot. And one of the other things they have to do is report any passports that they've issued. And so I'm digging through those things, looking for that needle in a haystack. And I find it. What is it? In 1872, with no explanation, they report to Washington that DeLong had issued an American passport to Portman. And you might think, why didn't he have a passport already? This is sort of that time in American history when passports were not de rigueur. So when Portman initially went to Japan in 1860, he didn't need anything like that. But by 1872, apparently he needed that passport to go back to the United States. So DeLong issues a passport. Boy, I wish I could have been in the room when that happened. There must have been some sort of like good riddance feelings in the air. But he gives Portman that passport, and Portman leaves Japan shortly thereafter. Where does he go? Initially he goes to Holland. This is pretty hard to track down. I was looking at ships logs and passenger lists and whatnot, and it was very hard to find that specific record, but he leaves, he goes to Holland, I assume visiting family. And then after a few months in Holland, he goes to the United States, maybe to visit family and friends. I think his brother was still living in the United States at that time. And certainly, he'd been there at least long enough to make some connections. So he's in the United States for a few months. And then he decides he's going to return to Europe, back to Holland. And so in November of 1873, he boards a ship, and that ship is scheduled to sail from New York to Le Havre. That ship was the Ville du Havre. Um, this is where Portman's in the wrong place at the wrong time because that ship sank. It ran into another one. It sank, and most of the passengers, including Portman, perished. Maybe this is one of the reasons why we don't have much in the way of records of Portman. Maybe he actually kept a journal and the journal sank with him. I don't know. Um, but that was the sad end of his life. So why does Portman matter? I think he matters because throughout that whole period between Perry and the early Meiji, he's a figure. He's providing that continuity. He's the one person who stays the same at the U.S. ministry while those ministers shuffle through or cycle through. So that's important. He's also interesting to me because he shows why language is important um, in diplomatic infrastructure, in diplomatic communications. And he's also interesting to me just because from day one, when I started looking at the Bakumatsu and thinking about that period, I always wonder, how are these people communicating? Who's doing the communication? Those interpreters, they had tremendous power in a way. One slip of the word, one twist in one direction or another, whether intentional or unintentional, they had tremendous power as historical agents. So that's the end of my talk, and I will stop sharing. And I welcome comments and conversation and questions.
Okay, everybody, please unmute. Thank you very much for that beautifully researched and presented talk about this man. We have a good number of questions here. So if nobody minds, let's plow through them. I think you're getting there. Okay, first one's from David Burley. He asks, might there have been bad feelings towards Portman after his long battle to get properly paid for helping Townsend?
In Washington, maybe. Yeah. I mean, if you go through the congressional record about that, it was sort of a 50-50 split in terms of, people in the Navy who said, no, we shouldn't pay him anymore. He's just asking for stuff he doesn't need. And then there were people in Congress that said, no, he actually, served the United States well. So that's one of the reasons why it took 5 years for him to get paid, because it wasn't a simple decision, and it had to go through a whole bunch of different levels before they agreed to do that. I couldn't find any record of anyone privately saying this Portman guy, he's a piece of work, we don't like him. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was out there.
Susanna, may I just say something? Just talking about the British service, the interpreters were very low paid. As Ian will know, Ernest Sato complained that he was less
Yeah.
paid than Dutch interpreters, even though he spoke Japanese. Um, and they were certainly less well paid than you know, even reasonably junior consular staff. So it's quite very different attitude towards the business to say that he should have been paid much more because he could speak Dutch.
Yes, there was a man called Euston in the British service when Sato arrived, who was, I think he was able to interpret from Japanese to Dutch and possibly the other way. But as far as reading and writing, he wasn't any good at all. So I think Sato rather resented him. Yeah.
I mean, sorry, the Chinese were very useful in Nagasaki. So Morrison spoke Chinese, and he said he got along fine in Nagasaki. So there's quite a lot of Chinese
Yeah.
spoken there, but not in the rest of Japan. But slightly wonder why they didn't put their communications in writing,
Yeah.
because I mean, Japanese and Chinese is similar enough in writing that you could get the gist of what someone was saying by looking at how they wrote it, I would have thought.
Yeah, so a little side note about Williams. He had an amanuensis, and who was an old man who was Chinese. His name was Xie. That's all I know. I don't know his full name. He was all just called Old Xie. So Williams couldn't write he couldn't be a scribe in Chinese. So he was dependent on his amanuensis. And Old Xie, unfortunately, was an opium addict. And Williams refused to let him have any opium. And so it didn't take long between leaving China and traveling toward Japan. Old Xie eventually he has withdrawal, extreme withdrawal, and he dies. And so at that point, Perry has to replace him, has to find a new amanuensis, and they find somebody who's from Shanghai, who I don't know who his name was, but the record gets us all wrong. The record says, "Oh, we got our translator from Shanghai, and that was Portman," as if Portman himself were living in Shanghai and they just picked him up. So there's that confusion there about who was doing what. And then you don't hear any more about that scribe. Portman, I don't think, he worked really hard at speaking and listening. I'm not sure about reading and writing. So yeah, that might have been another hurdle for him.
Well,
I would think. Oh, sorry. I would think Williams was more interested in his missionary work, wasn't he? If you said that Perry convinced him, but he didn't even really want to do it in the beginning, right. Did he? Is that?
No, he didn't. His arm was twisted.
Yeah. Sorry, Rosita.
Okay.
As for the communication via writing, I mean, in the Bakufu period, there was still a lot of people who could write Kambun, and classical Chinese, and also on the Chinese side. So what Robert said, it was not only a kind of guessing, they could really communicate, right? They could have theoretically communicated writing in Kambun. And
yeah, and they did it. Hitsudan, right? That's the word for it. Hitsudan was a thing, and it was a thing for quite a bit of time in diplomatic relations, but eventually it was like this third appendage. So they would include classical Chinese, include Kambun in documents, and eventually they just said, yeah, we don't need this. It's extra now that we have this system of English, Dutch, Japanese. And so the Kambun part of that then stopped being included in the back and forth.
Yeah, sorry, can I just, not you need it, but the Japanese really didn't like communicating with Europeans and Americans in Chinese. And also, the thing is that at the British service, I don't know about the American service, they had quite a lot of people who were very good at Chinese, very competent at the language, but they couldn't spare them because China was a lot more important than Japan. They didn't want to spare them. Japan was not a priority.
Okay. All right. So Robert also asked a question about 20 minutes into this. He says, "Are you sure that number 2 in the mission photo isn't Portman?"
Yes, because that particular photo actually has, if you look at it, it has numbers above each head, and there's an accompanying key that tells you who all the figures are. And I don't have it right at hand, so I can't tell you who that second figure is, but it's not Portman.
Right. Because I think it looks very like him.
It does. It does. Although I think he's taller than Portman was. That was my first suspicion when I saw the photograph. Like, oh, maybe that's him. And that photograph is all over the internet. You can find it in any number of places. But that particular one that I showed you is unusual because it actually labels the people. Most of the time you find that photograph and it doesn't tell you who is who.
All right, then Ian Ruxton asks around slide 20, the Niagara looks enormous. Is that the actual size or exaggerated for effect?
I think it's exaggerated for effect.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Charles DeWolf says, how did one pass through Panama before the construction of the canal?
One did not.
Exactly.
Sorry, what?
So here's the thing. So Prine, for example, he took a boat from New York down to the Isthmus and then took overland transportation from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, and then boarded another boat and then went to Japan. So there's no canal, but that they still went across Panama to get to Japan. And as a side note, this is really tragic. Initially, Prine took two of his sons with him. He had three sons. And his eldest son contracted something, maybe typhoid fever. It was never clearly diagnosed, crossing the isthmus. And eventually, by the time they got to San Francisco, going back up the coast, that son had died. And so when Prine left San Francisco, he got delayed because he had to bury his son in San Francisco. And then he and his second son continued on to Japan.
He was about 18, wasn't he, the one who died?
Yes.
Yeah. The younger son was 15, yeah, the one who went on to Japan, which is another interesting story.
Okay, all right, next, Charles DeWolf. No, wait, that was his. The next, Ian Ruxton says, does Prine mention any British people such as Ernest Sato?
He doesn't mention Sato. He mentions diplomatic higher ups, so his equivalents, not just from Britain, but France and the Netherlands.
But Neil and Dalcock in the text,
yeah, he doesn't talk very much about other people. I get the impression, reading through Sato and the other chroniclers of that area at that time, that Prine was viewed as kind of, to use a really modern term, kind of stuck up kind of guy. And he was very prim and proper. He was very concerned about his reputation. And he very much saw himself as above a lot of the expat community. And as many of you probably know, he was the last foreign diplomat to leave Edo. And the only reason he left Edo and moved down to Yokohama was because his legation was burned down. It was arson, but the Bakufu tried to convince him to leave. And they said, you're not safe here. Why don't you go where all the other foreigners are? And he said, no, I'm going to stay here. And eventually they made it such that he had to leave.
Wow. Okay, hang on a second.
Oh, Patricia, just a little bit up. Ian mentions he's never seen a portrait of Houston. I'm interested too. Susanna, where did you get that image of Houston? Because there's one of his dead body that's famous, and there's another one that I've seen, but that's an interesting one you found, yeah?
It's in a lot of places. Actually, there's a Wikipedia page dedicated to him, and I think that's where I got that particular image, but I've seen it in other places.
Oh, okay.
Okay, Charles DeWolf asks around slide 31, what were the specific accusations made against Portman?
That he had improperly, he was, had been the improper steward is the right way, mishandled legation papers. So that was one thing. And in that he had kept them in his private residence, taking them away from DeLong. I think this was a power play. I think that was probably true. Portman was meticulous as a secretary, and DeLong was really sloppy. And Portman, I think, felt like these papers are not safe in this guy's hands. So he took some of those things and stored them in his own place. So that was one of the things that DeLong accused him of. DeLong accused him of not being a U.S. citizen. That was another thing. He
Quite an
accused.
accusation.
Yeah, that's another reason why I wish there were a fly on the wall when the passport was issued, because it wouldn't have been issued if he weren't an American citizen, right? DeLong was the one who had to issue it. And then there were some other trumped up charges. Sorry, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head about things that he was not supposed to do that he had done. It was the big one was land ownership. So Portman lived on a plot of land that he claimed that Van Valkenburg had bestowed upon him and originally had been property of the U.S. government. And Van Valkenburg, in a verbal agreement, said to Portman, yes, you can just live there. You can have it. I'm giving it to you. No big deal. Gentleman's agreement, shake of hands. And then DeLong found this out and thought this is something I can charge him with, and so he did. And that was the justification for when Portman was away to have DeLong's henchmen go and repossess all his furniture and all the belongings of the house.
Thank you.
Just before that, Ian Ruxton asked, was it Portman who played down the possibility of the emperor being restored? If so, how did he misunderstand that, talking to the wrong people?
Yeah, I think it was talking to the wrong people. So all his friends were in the Bakufu.
Oh, okay.
And he didn't have the opportunity to meet with anybody on the imperialist side.
Satsuma Choshu kind of people.
Yeah.
But it was extraordinary how Van Valkenburg really, 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 went till the bitter end. He kept his loyalty to the Bakufu, even when they were, the Republic in Hokkaido. It was when it was so apparent that the imperial forces had won. He, and of course France as well, was so dogged in supporting. They never wavered on that.
Why was that? I mean, was that a matter of national prestige? The Brits are on the other side, so I
think
don't know.
in the case of France, they were so invested in the Tokugawa regime.
Right.
They just
Shipbuilding and stuff.
Van Valkenburg is the real mystery because America wasn't nearly as involved. Obviously, Civil War was going on. Civil War started 1861, I think, did it? So America did not have their eye on the ball very much. I mean, certainly the nation was much, 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 million times more concerned about what was happening in the United States than what was happening in Japan, which meant that there was very, very little naval support, which meant that it was so difficult to do anything at all because America had no means of persuading anyone to do it.
Yeah, and I think reading through all the stuff about Portman that he had, I didn't mention it earlier, but he had a lot of ambition, and during that initial period before Huskin is assassinated, he was pretty active in contacting Bakfu officials, which he wasn't supposed to do because he didn't have an official position with the United States government. The Bakfu initially sort of rebuffed him. So what was he trying to do? Two things in particular that he was interested in. One was establishing a railroad, and another was establishing a bank, like like the federal bank that in the United States, right? They rebuffed him and said, we can't talk to you about this stuff because this would have to come from your official government representative. And then eventually, Portman is the official representative, and by that time, those ideas of the railroad and the bank had kind of fallen by the wayside. The bank more so than the railroad, but that gave him that opportunity to press on those sorts of things. And that was all done through Kone, right? The connections that he had, and the connections that he had were all with the Bakfu. So if he wanted to see any of these ambitions or these dreams that he had come to fruition, I think he thought it had to happen through those connections, which is why he, wasn't talking to the other side, and perhaps why he was talking in the ear of the American ministers saying, yeah, we really should be siding with the Bakfu. When Prime first got to Japan, he wrote a dispatch back to Washington that I'm only mildly paraphrasing. It says, this place is kind of hard to understand. I can't tell who's in charge.
Yeah, that sounds
So staunch.
reasonable.
Familiar. Okay. All right. Robert Morton then asked the question, Portman couldn't leave when he was fired by DeLong. Is it because he couldn't afford the passage?
I don't think so. I think it was because he was told, DeLong basically told him he couldn't leave.
Wow.
Because the thing is that dismissal in the British service, sorry, that what I know about. I mean, it was such a drastic punishment because if you left someone in China or Japan, the cost of the passage was absolutely huge compared with their pay. So I would be surprised if Portman could afford it if his passage was not being paid by the US government.
Yeah, and I don't know if he had any income after he got fired by DeLong. By that time, he had a lot of Japanese friends, but there's nothing I could find that would say he was in some way bringing in money.
Yeah, because of course
So
it was massively more expensive but compared to today's standards, I mean, obviously it was a really, really massive expenditure.
I mean, it might have been that when DeLong was in Washington, someone pulled him aside and said, "Hey, lay off a Portman," because Washington was very nonpartisan, maybe I could say. They're very sympathetic to Portman's plight, but they couldn't side with Portman because DeLong was the senpai and Portman was the kohai. And so maybe that was a conversation that happened in Washington too. And they said, when you get back to Japan, please arrange for him to come home.
Did Portman require some kind of signature from DeLong to be released to go back to the US?
He got the passport.
Oh, he got the passport.
That was kind of it, right? So DeLong signs on the passport. I don't know who paid the cost, the fare of returning to Europe.
Because at the time, sorry, I'm talking about the British service again. I mean, the secretary couldn't write to the Secretary of State. I mean, it was only the minister. Or
he did, though.
But
yeah,
that was considered, in the British service, that was considered to be outrageous behavior.
Yes.
It was the minister, and they would get everything from the minister, and the minister just had to be someone they had to trust them. And so they couldn't work out who was right and who was wrong.
It's very interesting to read through that stuff, and that's the stuff that didn't get reported to Congress. So if you want to read it, you got to go to the microfiche, and you have to squint a lot. But there was a huge back and forth between both men and Washington.
Who was it? Was it not the Secretary of State? Was it the Secretary of State?
It was, yeah, and the Secretary of the State at the time was Fish.
Yeah.
Mm.
I mean that
The Portman
he
started
did
under
have other
Seward.
fish to fry. I mean, he really did have a lot else going on. So he devoted quite a bit of time to this dispute.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, by this point, the Civil War is over, so
Yeah.
it's a little bit easier. During the Civil War, that was during Prime's tenure in Japan. There was none of that friction. But then afterwards, it really builds.
Okay.
But did you just say Fish had other fish to fry? Is that what you
Yes,
Sorry.
he did.
But he would have done.
said? I didn't quite believe my ears on the first
No.
go.
But Japan just wasn't very important to the United States at the time. The
Yeah,
trade was
exactly.
really small. So I mean, there were things that were useful about having, relations with Japan, but compared with America's relationship with sort of like Europe, South America, other places, Japan and China, of course, Japan was small fry, I think, for the United States in the 1860s. Sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. All right, Robert, I forgive you. All right. Alex Byrne asks, are there any mentions of the Portman-DeLong conflict in the English newspapers in Yokohama at the time?
Not that I saw.
Yeah.
And actually, there were some mention. There was a mention much later, and I'm trying to think when it was. I want to say it was the early 1870s. I'm sorry, I can't remember now. In which someone, maybe even after Portman died, someone says, the American legation has been a mess from day one, and why don't we get somebody competent in this position? And it says some really mean things about Portman. Portman never even learned any Japanese, and on and on. And so I think his reputation had been greatly sullied by DeLong.
Yeah.
And I noticed there's a Japanese Wikipedia page for Portman, and the only other language is Azerbaijani. So there's no
Yes.
English. There's no English Portman entry on Wikipedia even. So yeah.
Yeah, it's somewhere on my to-do list.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, just a couple more questions here. Robert Morton asks, says by 1872, the Transcontinental Railroad was operating. So did Portman go to the Netherlands via the U.S.? It was the quickest way.
No, I don't think so. I think he left Japan. He stopped, if I remember correctly, stopped in Hong Kong,
Right.
and then continued on.
Probably it was to do with the availability of a ship that could take him, probably.
Right. It wasn't just a given. It wasn't like you just walk down and,
No.
buy a ticket kind of thing. You really had to
Might
book
have to
that.
wait weeks for a ship to cross the Pacific.
Yeah.
Okay, last question I have here from Michael Plastow. He says, does Portman's name appear much or at all in Japanese histories of the period? Do we know what the Japanese of the time thought of him and his services?
I have read through a lot of those records as best I can. And if you've ever looked at them, sometimes the microfiche is really poorly put together, and you can't see what's there. It's bad enough that the language is kind of tricky, but in any case, he's mentioned occasionally. One of the big tricks is that his name is rendered differently in different places, kind of like Prime's name. So you have to kind of learn what all the different possibilities are, whether it's Portoman or Portoman or, what have you. So he appears in a few records, but nothing that's gossipy, nothing that tells you about his personality or anything in particular like that. Certainly if he met during that year that he was chargé d'affaires, if he met with government officials, that was recorded. I find those records really surprising and fascinating because the Japanese recorded everything. If there was a conversation, it's in the record. The whole thing, you know, so and so said this, so and so said that. And I thought because of that, you know, surely there'd be more information there about Portman.
He's in some of those hand painted scrolls where you see Perry and Adams, and there are caricatures of him, like, and I think it looks more like Hotman in Japanese. I don't know if there's even Hotman, and he's got a big nose and sort of glasses,
and a big mustache.
yeah. So, but there aren't many images of him at all, which is strange.
No.
Okay. Well, that's it for the questions for like next 10 minutes or so. If there's any general conversation, let's have at it. But first, let me say once again, thank you. Thank you very much for this intense and a wonderful conversation between you.
You're welcome. And I would say all the detail, I mean, a talk, you can't give very much detail, but if you want to really look at the detail and the sources, this is all in the article that I published, goodness, now like 2 years ago, about Portman. Unfortunately, I published it with Brill and they charge a usurious amount to buy it, but apparently you can rent it. So that might be an option if you're really curious. Or if you're patient, you can just wait until it becomes public domain.
Okay. Else? Yes, Charles.
I don't know how well Portman managed to learn Japanese, but if he didn't succeed, one can hardly blame him. When you think about what resources there are today, and then think about how difficult it was back in his day to even begin.
Yes.
Pushing and I,
Yes.
Any comment on that?
Well, one of the things that, I mean, I know that he worked at it because he recorded having worked on it, you know, in one of those letters home or back to the United States. But one of the other things that really impressed me was that when things went south with DeLong, and there was a point where Portman decided it was time to get out of Dodge. And so he leaves the approved area for foreigners and he goes off to the Northwest and hides out with friends for a while. And you know, those friends were not foreigners, they were Japanese. And those friends, they were taking a big chance, because if they had found out that they were housing a foreigner outside of the approved bounds, I'm sure there would have been repercussions. And I don't think he could have arranged to do that if his Japanese wasn't at least pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think he would have gone off and had no conversation with these people who were putting their lives on the line to put him up.
Diplomats were allowed to go wherever they wanted.
I'm sorry?
Diplomats were allowed to go wherever they wanted.
But at this point, he'd already been fired.
So he wasn't a diplomat anymore. Right. So, yes, I see. Amazing. I mean, at the time, it was so hard to get anywhere in Japan. You didn't need to go somewhere so remote.
He just wanted to I think he just wanted to get away from the expat community because because DeLong had defamed him so much.
Yeah.
But you have to wonder how he would have been smuggled out of the foreign settlement, you know, I suppose in a cargo or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Palanquin, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, he would have only really had Medhurst's Japanese English vocabulary book that was done in 1830 in Batavia, I think. And I found a few years ago, this manuscript copy of letters that were written. I'm just checking who it was so long, called George Folsom, Folsom, and he was the U.S. charge d'affaires in the Netherlands, and he sent a copy of Medhurst's book to the U.S. for Perry to take, and that was and he even wrote then it was a very rare book, not printed in the usual way, but lithographed, and it was done, you know, by Walter Henry Medhurst in Batavia, the London Missionary Society, and he'd never been to Japan, of course, and it's a big thing with a lot. I mean, it was amazing things. I'm sure Portman would have had one of them,
Right.
but not much else, I'd say.
Right, but Sato was taking lessons from Reverend Brown, who was producing a dictionary, wasn't he? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
So I don't know why Portman was not aware of that and perhaps didn't try to get into the same deal or something. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very interesting.
I mean, Sato was a genius.
Yeah.
Well,
Language
true.
genius. I wouldn't have wanted to study Japanese with Sato.
Yes, right.
But Sato came in when? 62, 61?
Yes.
Right.
62.
So, I mean, Portman's here in 54, 5, right? I mean,
oh, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then
the
back in
first trip. So that's totally different. Yeah.
That is totally different. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
quite
I mean, Sato
amazing.
was so quick in how he got his competent in Japanese. Really competent, and not just speaking and reading and writing as well.
And Susanna, wasn't there? I'm just trying to think. Was it in Prine's letters where he mentions that Portman wanted to get the pen that they used to sign something with?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm sure he had lots of stuff with him when either that ship sank or he had it somewhere. Maybe it's still tucked away.
That was not in the Prime letters, but that was in the Japanese record. One of the Japanese records that Portman was really excited about. Can I have that writing brush, that the thing that was used to sign the treaty?
That was the treaty, wasn't it? Yeah, it was a big thing. Yeah. So he could spot a possible future valuable item by having the brush that was used to sign or pen. Yeah.
Exactly. And for the Japanese, it was like, that's weird because that wasn't a thing for them, but it was already a thing in the United States to have that writing implement. Yes.
Oh no, I mean, this is totally different, but it reminds me when, Lise Doucette, the CNN lady, who the French quite high level reporter, Lise Doucette, quite experienced. And I always remember Obama was signing this some agreement with countries, and they use multiple pens to sign. He'll sign with one pen, and then he'll sign with another pen. So there's like 5 pens they use to sign 5 copies. And it was so funny because Lise Doucette said, "Oh, I hope he can find a pen that works soon." But she got that wrong. It was actually they do it on purpose, so there were a few pens used. So reminds me of that. Yeah, that's keeping great. Those pens.
On that note, if you don't mind, I'd like to end the recording at this point and go on to just informal discussion. So once again, Dr. Susanna Fessler, thank you so much for sharing your recording.
Right.